Operation Barbarossa was the largest scale military operation in recorded history. The attack itself was launched more on an ideological principle than anything else. Hitler wanted to subjugate Russia, despite his non-aggression pact from the 2 years prior, mainly because of his ideas that Eastern Slavic peoples were racially inferior to the German race. In fact, Hitler was said to have never thought about the political aspect of the operation. He only thought about it in terms of a racial battle. He wanted to make Germany into a dominant nation, and to do that, he believed he had to subjugate all inferior races, and to seize their lands as a Lebensraum,
Lebensraum,
literally living space, to grow such a nation. After creating stability in the West, in terms of attacking Britain and conquering France, the Germans wouldn't have to fear fighting a two-front war, and could freely attack Russia to gain such a Lebensraum. And so, on March of 1941, he began planning his assault of the Soviet Union. So, how did Hitler's plan of invading Russia go? Well, it actually went fairly well off, at the start. On June 22nd of 1941, a massive military invaded Russia with a line stretched across 1,800 miles. Their forces were massive. With 2,700 warplanes and 186 divisions of various Axis soldiers, the invading force punctured deep within Russia, who was unprepared for such an unprecedented invasion. Hitler's invasion was one of harsh conquest due to his racist ideals. He didn't want to subjugate the people in these areas. Oh no, he meant to kill them all, to make room for his precious Lebensraum. In fact, he told his soldiers and officers that they had to, quote, rid themselves of obsolete ideologies, and that this operation was one of racial differences, which was to be conducted with unprecedented, unmerciful, and unrelenting harshness. Hitler's divisions pierced and blitzkrieged through the soft shell of Russia with a swift ease. Many large cities fell, and tens of thousands of Russians were captured with each fall. By October of that year, the Nazis had captured approximately 3 million Soviet soldiers. Commanders of Russia often fled, or were just simply not around, so even what little resistance could be fought with was trounced due to the lack of any command. But eventually the operation started to go a little bad for the Nazis. Firstly, Russian forces began to stand their ground and rally behind Stalin towards the defense of the Soviet Union. The fact that Germany was not there to liberate the common people of the harsh Russian leaders, but to conquer them, turned everyday people against Germany's side so hard that they had to fight back. Second, the utter size of the lad, Russia, caused wear on the Germanic soldiers and caused supply lines to be severely affected. As tensions grew higher, Hitler and his generals faced a strategic choice. Would they stick to the original plan of Barbarossa, or would they go for the more traditional route of conquest, to subjugate the capital? His general advised him to launch a fierce attack in the summer, while the conditions were still favorable, so as to destroy the political, military, and transportation center of Russia. This didn't line up with Hitler's ideals for his operation, however. He wanted to conquer as much territory as possible. Along with this, he reasoned, there were strategic opportunities for sticking to the original plan. Attacking Ukraine would systematically destroy armies and free up agricultural and industrial land for the Germans, not to mention the oil fields which were held there. Conquering Leningrad would destroy Russian morale due to its state of being named after one of their founders. And so, the operation remained the same. The commanders of the Nazi army redirected troops, supplies, and war machines from the Central Force to the North and South forces, who were to take Leningrad and Ukraine, respectively. In late September, the Southern group captured Kiev, the center city of the targeted area, which netted them 650,000 prisoners of war. Sometime later, the Northern group approached Leningrad, an old, beautiful city with many palaces. Their orders were to completely bombard the area and to flatten the city. Things were still going rather well for the Nazis at this point, despite the further stiffening of Soviet forces. However, as the summer began to wane, the generals once again implored Hitler to go on an all-out blitzkrieg attack on the capital with all of their forces before the winter came. "Oh sure, go ahead," said Hitler, twirling his rectangular mustache and sipping on his crushed soda. "But I want you guys to take Leningrad and Stalingrad first." His generals looked at him, with their eyes wide open, and their jaws firmly placed upon the floor. Was Hitler asking them to take on 3 major cities all at once? "Sir, you want us to split up all of our groups all at once?" "Yes, sir, all 3. Realizing the danger, the Mad Lads asked Hitler to focus on Moscow alone. But Hitler only did that cool thing that the anime boys in my anime did, where he flashed a menacing smile while pushing his glasses up to his face. Meanwhile, troops of the Central Group waited outside Moscow for the second month in a row, waiting until they finally got the word to advance on the capital. By the time they finally did get the order, on October 2nd of that year, snow was already slowly falling. As the North Group and the South Group marched on Leningrad and Stalingrad respectively, the Center Group began their invasion into Moscow, which appeared to be an easy conquer at first. The 2 armies protecting the city were easily wiped out by the Germans, and they took 660,000 prisoners. By mid-October, they were within range of the city itself. As they drew near, Stalin was incredibly tempted to flee, and he almost did. He went as far as to arrange a train for his departure. However, he decided against departing. His refusal to leave was pivotal in Russia winning against the Nazis. Firstly, the autumn rains of Russia stopped German tanks and other equipment from moving due to all the mud. Second, those rains promptly turned to snowfalls in the November season, halting and freezing the unprepared German soldiers. Hitler's soldiers were suffering from frostbite and hypothermia. The Nazis had planned for a swift victory in Russia, not for a battle in the cold. They were ill-prepared, having to steal cloth scarves from villages to starve off the winter. They required heavy clothing, but there was none. The supply lines were halted due to the trucks not being able to handle the off-roading of the winter. And this affected the morale of the Nazi soldiers too. The once proud, disciplined German elite soldiers were now crabby, salty, misbehaved children. Hitler didn't see this as a problem, however. He finally saw that Leningrad and Stalingrad were unable to be taken in the cold, but he wasn't about to give up and retreat from Moscow, so he ordered his soldiers to march on and to take Moscow through the cold winter. It was a bitter struggle on both sides, Nazi and Russian, leading to some of the most ruthless brutality yet seen in Eastern Europe. Hitler ordered malnourished, frostbitten, and hopeless soldiers to subjugate Moscow. Stalin ordered all soldiers, most of whom were drafted or displaced, who became deserters of the Russian army, to be shot. In both of their eyes, there was no chance of retreat. Both had too much to lose. In the end, Hitler underestimated the power of the Soviet Union, that the leadership did not care for its people, and that those people were willing to sacrifice everything for the good of the communist state. In a short 3 months, the unstoppable Nazi military machine was systematically humiliated and defeated at the Battle of Moscow.
そこが付け目だ。それでたった一つの策とは？こっちも足を使うんだ。足をどうやって？逃げるんだよー！さあきー！どけ！野獣ども！
Firstly, the end of this operation was one that gave hope to many allied nations, or just nations that were indirectly against the Nazi regime. It proved to them that the Nazis could be defeated. The Russian victory, long since discarded as an absurd idea ever since Germany invaded, gave many people hope that they would be defeated, and their terrible, inhumane ways would finally cease. Second, the Russian victory and hostile conditions destroyed many other tanks, lots of their equipment, and it killed thousands of good soldiers. Finally, because of their failed invasion, the Germans would then have to fight a war against two fronts, and with not as many resources at their disposal. The Nazi failure here set up the stage for their ultimate surrender in 1945. But what if Hitler invaded Moscow in the summer and followed through on his plan to grab a victory over Russia during the summer months? There are a number of places, in the part of history I've told you all about, where a decision could have been made to save the Nazis from their embarrassing defeat at the hands of the Soviet Union. We could drop in right when Hitler was planning Operation Barbarossa, back in March of 1941, or right when Hitler denied his generals for the first time to attack Moscow in the summer with their combined strength in favor of a split attack on two separate towns. Or heck, maybe even for the second or third time. I find the decision most interesting to rewrite would be that first denial to attack Moscow in the summer. So let's rewind and say that Hitler followed his general's advice and attacked Moscow right when Soviet forces began to hold their ground in the summertime. What would happen? Well, for starters, it wouldn't be so cold. A good chunk of the Nazi army died from the cold and conditions surrounding the cold. Along with that, the cold kept them from receiving supplies, and it halted their approach as the tanks and artillery could not move forward in the icy terrain. With the summer temperatures, the Nazis could easily attack Moscow at full strength. Along with this, the generals of Russia would not have had as much experience fighting the Nazis, as the one that fought in the wintertime in the true timeline had become accustomed to fighting them. Although this wouldn't have been a problem for the Russians, had Stalin not dismissed his most knowledgeable and capable commanders from World War I in paranoia. So, let's say with these strong odds against the Russians, Hitler succeeds in taking Moscow. So, now what? Well, shortly afterward, Russia as well would probably fall. Like I mentioned earlier, Stalin was making plans to evacuate the government from Moscow. Just not the citizens. So, the entire government of Russia would be displaced from their own home, which would not only kill Russian morale, but it would also make all armies and commanders unorganized. It's safe to say that, unless the armies found their way to Stalin and began to make preparations for counterattacks, that they would be wiped out by the end of the year, like how Barbarossa was originally planned. So, Russia's down. A key Allied player in the Second World War, whose prior position in the real timeline allowed the Allies to strike against Germany in a two-front offensive. So, what are the lasting impacts of this new decision, besides Russia being out of the game? Well, for starters, Germany would still have much of their fighting force. Morale wouldn't have been negatively affected due to their victory, rather than defeat, at Moscow. This, along with no Russian support for the Allies, would cause World War II to go on for much longer, due to the increased amount of soldiers available, and the ability to not have to fight the war on two fronts against the West and the East. So the primary concern is that World War II would have been a much more bitter struggle than it already was. Second, even after the war ended, there's the question of what would become of Russia. Well, since the Nazis succeeded in subjugating that land for Lebensraum, the Slavic peoples there would have probably suffered the same fate as the Jews in the West. It would be highly likely that Germany would set up concentration camps for these people. This would likely mean that Russia would have to rebuild its government from scratch, and it would not have emerged from World War II as a world power. Third, hundreds of thousands of more people would have died from the brutal conflict, from both concentration camps and the war front combined. It might have even resulted in the extinction of almost every Jewish person in those camps, save for a few who somehow soldiered through it. So, not great. Really not great for the world had Hitler decided on invading Moscow earlier in the summertime. This terrible conflict would have dragged on, killing many more people than we could even fathom now. It would have also caused Russia to disband as the Soviet Union, most likely, and form a new government, which would mean that the Cold War probably wouldn't have happened. And if the Cold War didn't happen, we probably wouldn't be as close to furthering space travel than we are now. We might have not even had a reason to go to space in the slightest. Third, the Nazi dream of exterminating what they believed to be inferior races would have come closer to fruition. Operation Barbarossa was a brutal dispute between two very ideologically different nations. Had Hitler chosen to invade Moscow earlier in the season, then the world would be a very different place, and the topic of World War II would be a much more subdued and somber topic than it already is.